Hi guys, welcome back to another video tutorial where we are on the topic of programming using C. And in our last video tutorial we were able to provide a program that displayed a message on screen and also to collect input from the user. So for that we were introduced to two data types, which were integers and character, as well as string. So technically it was three data types there. All right, so for this video presentation we will be proceeding to see how is it that we can perform calculations in a program. So let's begin. Again, we know line 1 includes our preprocessor and header files, so those would be the include, followed by the header that we're using, the standard input output header. Following that we would have our line that contains our main function, and then the main function would indicate that we're now proceeding to start writing the main attributes or aspect of our program. So after this we would have been introduced to declaring variables, and then just to remind you, for this tutorial we are expected to collect two numbers from a user and then send it into a location called sum, right? So sum will be able to add these two numbers together and give us the final figure that we receive after that calculation. So first thing that we're doing is to declare our variables. We know that we technically need three things. We're going to need a location to store the first number, we're going to need a location to store the second number, and we're also going to be needing a location to store the sum of those two numbers. So there are two ways that we could go ahead and initialize these variables. So again, we start off with a data type and then the variable name, and if it is that we're assigning default values we could do that. So let's begin. The data type is int followed by the variable name. So the first number we can store it in a location called num1, all right, followed by our semicolon. So that would give us our first initial declaration. Second one, again, variable data type, which is int followed by the variable name. So the second number could be stored in a location called num2. Thirdly, after we have received those two numbers, they are expected to also be stored in a location by itself, and we are going to refer to this location as sum because the two numbers would be added together. Again, data type int, and this would be sum. All right, followed by our semicolon. These data types could also be changed for the fact that they are numbers, so they could also be numbers that are decimal numbers. So we're going to proceed with the integers first, and then afterwards we can change it to see how the decimals would look. All right, so this is one way that we could go ahead and declare our variables. All right, another way that we could bypass the second line, because we know that technically we're working with three integer data type. So I could go ahead and remove this and then just continue. We know that the general data type is integer, and then what are the integer variables that we're declaring? So we already declared num1. We're going to be including the others by separating them with a comma. So a comma indicates that we have a second integer coming through. This was num2, and a comma again to indicate there's a third integer in the list here coming through, and this would have been sum. All right, so we have declared our variables. We did not apply any default value for this one because we will be doing a second example where we could go ahead and do that. All right, so our next line we could go ahead now to have our output function that will allow a message to be displayed on screen. So we know that the keyword that we use whenever we're doing output is printf. All right, followed by the bracket, and within the bracket the double quotation. What is the message that we want to show? For the first thing, we're collecting the num1, so a message could say please enter the first number. All right, so the user would now be allowed to enter their see this message. So we're done with this line. At the end outside of the bracket we have our semicolon. In our next line now, we want to allow the user to enter their number, and then at the same time, once they enter it, we want to store it back into that location called num1. So the input function that will allow the user to enter the number scanf followed by a bracket, and then we know there are two sections within our scanf. There's a first section which is located within our double quotation, and then also outside of this double quotation followed by a comma, our second part will be provided. Within our double quotation, this would give us what string format are we collecting. In this case, it would be an integer, and if we can recall, the format string that we use for integer would be the %d. So this collects the exact number from the user, and then the second part now indicates where are we going to store this number. The location to store the first number was called num1. And again, we remember that once we're collecting any numeric data, we would have the ampersand followed by the variable name. So in this case, the variable name is num1. On the outside of this, we're finished with this line, so we have the semicolon to say that this is where the collection of input from the user terminates. Next thing that we want is to present a next message to collect the second number from the user. So the process continues as previously. Printf to show message on screen. The message would be please enter second number. Alright, so once the user see this message now, they would be given the opportunity to go ahead and enter the number. The keyword that allows them to enter number is the scanf. So this is the function that permits that. Again, the double quotation for the first section followed by a comma where we will be presenting the second part. In our double quotation, we are asking what's the format string that we're collecting for the second number. The second number will be an integer, so it would be %d to represent integer. After the comma, we're asking what location will we store the second number. It will be in fact num2, and because the data type is a numeric value, we have the ampersand followed by the variable location. Right, so from this point we're finished with this line. We have our semicolon. So the user would have been able to now enter their two numbers, and then the next thing would be the sum. What is it that we would have to do in order to know what the sum is? We have to provide a formula to be able to calculate the sum. So in line 12, so we're skipping a few lines just for you to see properly. In line 12, we start off with the name of the variable location. So this is sum, right? Followed by the assignment value there, which is the equal sign, to tell that on the right hand side is where some things are going to take place, which would provide us with the sum to be stored on the left. What is it that we need to find the sum? The formula is num1 plus num2. Right, following this, we're through with this formula, so we would proceed with our semicolon to say that this formula has been completed. Final thing that we could also be including is a message now to display the sum on screen. So again, what keyword do we use or function do we use to display a message on screen? It is printf followed by a bracket, double quotation inside, and then the message to be displayed. So the message could say the sum is, and instead of putting the word the actual value for sum, because it can change and vary, we're going to use the format string that would pull whatever exact sum was stored. So in this case, sum was also an integer, so the format string %d, and then on the outside of the bracket we have the second part to tell us where is it that we're collecting this sum from. The name of that location was sum, so again we put it back as is. We're through with this line, so on the outside we have our semicolon to conclude that line. Alright, just a recap before we run the program. We started off with our preprocessor and our header, and we know that int main, without int main, we're not able to see anything displayed on screen. So within this, what is it that is supposed to take place? We first had to declare some variables that we will be collecting inputs from for the user, and also to store based on calculations to be performed. So we had some integers where we would store num1 for our first number, our second number stored in a location called num2, and then when we added these two numbers together, the results would be stored in a location called sum. From here, the user would now be able to see some things on screen. What will they be able to see? The first thing that they will be able to see on screen is a message that says, please enter your first number. The user would then be allowed to enter their first number through the use of a scanf and then this format string to collect the integer. Once we collect this, it is then sent to be stored in a location called num1. Again, the user receive a second prompt to say enter your second number, and that was also spelled incorrectly, so that's corrected now. Please enter your second number. Again, the user is given the privilege to enter that second number, and then once entered, it is sent to a location to be stored called num2. From here, we were not required to collect any other number from the user, so we would then proceed to do some calculation to tell the user what the sum of the two numbers were. So the formula that would allow us to see the final figure for these two numbers combined would be sum equal to num1 plus num2, and these are the location where the actual figures will be stored. Finally, the user would like to see a message on screen to tell them the final figure or the final value that was after the calculations were completed. So what allowed for the message to be printed on screen, a printf, to say the sum is, followed by the actual number to be displayed. So let's go ahead now to run this and see how the process takes place. Alright, so our first message is showing correctly where it asks to enter the first number. So let's say our first number was 12. Alright, once we click the 12 and enter, we get a second prompt to enter a second number. So this time the number is 10 in this case. Alright, so from here on now we could also manually calculate to see what will be the sum of these two numbers. So 12 added to 10 would give us a total of 22. So then the message that should be displayed on screen is the sum is 22. So let's go ahead and see if that's what we see presented. And indeed, that is the number that was provided. So the formula did work correctly, and then the program did exactly what it was expected to do. Another way that we could do this calculation is we could automatically assign some number. So let's say it was a constant where the person already knew the value, right? So we could then proceed to say, let's say num1 was equal to that 12, and then num2 in this case would be equal to 2. So automatically we know that the final sum for these is going to be added to 14. So we could also put the formula here as the constant to say sum will be num1 plus num2. Alright, so from here we could bypass these two messages because in this instance there would be no form of input coming in from the user and there would be no need for calculation to take place. So what I will do is to remove these two. So the only thing that I need now is just a message to show to say the sum is, and then we grab the sum. Alright, so again we know that the sum should be displayed to say the sum is 14. So if we run this program now, in fact it was correct because the computer got the numbers and then automatically it also had the formula to find these two numbers. So those are two ways that we could be able to perform our calculation to find the sum or the value of two numbers. Alright, so this would have wrapped up this video presentation. Thank you so very much for tuning in, and again please stay tuned for the other videos to come.